Hello. In this episode of the AS for Architecture podcast, Dr. Alistair Fair, architectural historian at the Edinburgh College of Art at the University of Edinburgh, discusses his latest book, Building Modern Scotland, A Social and Architectural History of the New Towns, 1947 to 1997, which he co-authored with Lynn Abrams, Kat Breen, Miles Glendenning, Diane Waters and Valerie Wright, and published with Bloomsbury in February this year.
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of A is for Architecture. I'm talking today to Alistair Fair, Dr. Alistair Fair of Edinburgh University. Alistair, thanks for being here today. We're going to be talking about your recent book, Building Modern Scotland, A Social and Architectural History of the New Towns, 1947 to 1997, which you wrote with a bunch of other people and published with Bloomsbury. But before we get to that and get to those other people, would you be so kind as to introduce yourself?
Thank you very much, Ambrose. It's really good to be here. So I'm Dr. Alistair Fair. I'm a reader in architectural history at the University of Edinburgh, and I'm a historian of 20th century architecture in Britain. And I'd always been interested in architecture before I became an architectural historian, if you like. I actually came to architectural history through history. So I'm not an architect. And I did history for my first degree, and through that discovered that you could actually study the history of buildings and places. And I've always been interested in that, but didn't really quite twig that this was something that you could actually study. So I sort of drifted into architectural history and began to specialise in the 20th century, and did quite a lot of work on theatre architecture for many years before turning to the new towns that are the subject of the new book.
Nice and neat. Is there something very specific about the character of architectural historiography that differentiates it, that makes, I suppose, it need a specific form of training?
That's a very good question. I think one of the interesting things about architectural history is that people bring different perspectives to it based on perhaps the disciplines that they come from or the kind of training that they have previously. So for me, I'm very much interested in the wider social historical contexts of architecture. And I'm also interested in what architecture can tell us as evidence if we want to investigate themes in social history or economic or political history. So for me, the task of the historian is to contextualize the architecture, but also to use the architecture as evidence. But I have colleagues in Edinburgh and elsewhere whose background is in history of art, and they come at the subject in perhaps a slightly different way, and other colleagues whose background is in architecture, architectural practice, who have other interests and other perspectives as well. So I think it's one of the kind of strengths of architectural history as a subject, if you like, that it can accommodate these kind of different perspectives. That could also make it quite challenging because, as I say, we all do the subject perhaps in slightly different ways.
I guess I'm interested in this idea of your interest in the social history, the wider context, because it moves architectural study away from the object, from object-oriented ontologies, as cool people call it. Is this a new kind of dimension or a relatively new dimension to architectural historiography? Was it previously more concerned with the kind of the description of buildings as objects?
I think for many years, architectural history was concerned with that idea primarily of the object. And I mean, again, we might want to kind of nuance that a little by saying that, you know, if you went back to the, say, 1950s, 60s, your perspective might have been different if you were working for what we now call a heritage organisation, as opposed to if you were someone that had come through a kind of more strongly art historical training. So, you know, even back in a more object-oriented kind of world, there might have been different kinds of perspectives. But certainly that idea of looking at wider context is something which emerged sort of in the final part of the 20th century. And also, I think, you know, the idea of decentering the architect within architectural history, again, is something which we can see emerging through the 1990s and into the 2000s, which basically starts to ask questions like, you know, who creates buildings and spaces? Obviously, architects are an important part of that story, but they're not necessarily the only part of that story. And by looking at who else might be involved in the process, we can perhaps get a more inclusive picture, one that looks at the different roles that people with sort of non-trained architectural backgrounds might bring into the picture as well. So I think there's certainly been a welcome broadening of what the focus of architectural history can be over the last few decades. But certainly in terms of my own approach, one of my colleagues joked a couple of years ago after hearing me do a seminar with our students in Edinburgh that, it's what you do, Alistair, it's very interesting, but the buildings are quite peripheral to it, aren't they? And I sort of said, well, maybe. They're important. What I work on, what I do, wouldn't exist without having buildings, designs, places, without having all of that it's somewhere in the mix. But I think for me, that's only part of the story. And I'm certainly not the sort of historian that's going to get obsessively fine-grained, detailed over, where's this particular little element being borrowed from or something like that. I think there are other stories that we can tell.
I agree. And I think it's particularly pertinent to the subject of the book because, of course, new towns still exist. So this is not historiography like looking at Angkor Wat or Stonehenge. This is places where people live. And so there seems to me to be a sociological aspect to your form of study. I mean, an ethnographic, I suppose, in that you can go and actually measure the efficacy of the artifacts you are discussing.
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, one of the ideas when the project that led to this book sort of first came about was the idea that the different researchers, the authors of the book, would bring different perspectives to the project, which would be partly rooted in looking at the places themselves, what you might call a sort of physical site survey, scaled up to the level of a town almost, but also the lives of people living there. And we're very conscious in doing this work, as I think you kind of have to be if you work on topics in the relatively recent past, that you are looking at places where people live and you're looking at people's actual kind of lives. So, I mean, the way the project came together really was that I'd been doing a lot of work on theatre architecture, and around 2018-19 I published
modern theatre
architecture, so post-war British theatre. And by about 2018-19 I'd published a couple of books, and I was thinking, what do I want to work on next? And I'd kind of always been aware of the new towns. I'm originally from Birmingham, and then my family moved to Glasgow when I was a teenager, and we lived very near East Kilbride, which was the first of the post-war Scottish new towns. So kind of aware of the new towns, that talked about them in teaching, knew that these were interesting places, but there was also a wee bit of a flurry of scholarship starting to emerge around sort of 2017, 18, 19, looking at some of the new towns. So I'm thinking Gael Tolano writing about the English new town of Milton Keynes. And in Glasgow, Lynn Abrams and Valerie Wright were among a team who were looking at East Kilbride. So I was really interested in what they were researching and the way that they were looking at the kind of social history and the lived experience of residents in East Kilbride. So I kind of thought it would be interesting to work with them. And I had colleagues in Edinburgh who are also specialists in 20th century architectural history, particularly 20th century Scottish architecture. So Kat Breen, Diane Waters and Miles Glendinning. So we put together this kind of multi-headed team that would bring together these different specialisms and expertise in terms of architectural site survey, in terms of archival research, in terms of the kind of wider contexts of the post-war period and its social history. And very much the idea of the research project, which was very generously funded by the Leverhulme Trust for a couple of years, the idea was to bring these different perspectives together to create a kind of different sort of account of the Scottish new towns, one that gave the architectural story, which thought about the planning of these places, but also looked at what happened over the next few decades by interviewing residents and drawing out their perspectives and using that to reflect on what the new towns were like to live in, but also, again, to use the new towns as evidence for some of the things that social historians are very much interested in at the moment, like the history of community and the history of the family.
Really interesting. When I was up in Scotland, I did get indeed to go to lots of the new towns. Can you name them? So we've got Irvine, East Kilbride.
Yes, so there are, there are 6 places which at one time or other were designated as new towns in post-war Scotland. So the big story here is that after the Second World War, central government across England, Scotland, Wales, and briefly Northern Ireland created a sequence of new towns. These were places selected by central government to grow as centres of population and places of employment and industry and leisure as well. So they're not just housing estates. The idea was that they would be, certainly in the early days, kind of self-contained communities that would be real towns with places to work and places to have fun as well as places to live. So the earliest one in Scotland, which was begun in 1947, was East Kilbride, which is just to the south of Glasgow. And that was followed in 1948 by Glenrothes, which is in eastern Scotland, in Fife. And then there's a slight pause until 1955 when you get Cumbernauld to the north of Glasgow. Then in the 1960s, you get Livingston in central Scotland and Irvine on the Ayrshire coast. And then finally, at the start of the 1970s, the last of the new town designations was called Stonehouse, which was only very briefly a new town. It was designated a new town in 1973 and then de-designated just 3 years later after fewer than 100 houses had been built. And that de-designation of Stonehouse marks a kind of turning point in the new town programme, that really after sort of 30 years where the new towns had been a real focus of public spending and of kind of architectural initiative, attention began to shift in the late 1970s back to the inner city. So the de-designation of Stonehouse is the kind of one of the pieces of evidence of that shift.
Quite like thinking about those few inner urban Glaswegian families that were moved out to Stonehouse with this vision. They had moved to this place that was going to become the next East Kilbride, and only to discover that very quickly it wasn't. You've talked about the need for a kind of post-war reconfiguration of British urban identity, and the building of the new towns falls into that. What's the main motivation behind that? Was this sort of an idea of, a sort of egalitarian idea about creating more just environments for working families, working people? Or was it a longer-term economic idea? Because obviously Britain was broke after the Second World War, so the idea of investing across the UK in these very large number of very large settlements is, I mean, we can't even imagine our way there now.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It is remarkable that in the sort of ending days of the Second World War, that this policy initiative was formulated, and then in the period of post-war austerity, it was funded. And that's not to say that it was easy sailing in those early days. There was this element of stop-start. But the new towns were seen as really, really important by policymakers, politicians, as well as reformers, social reformers and others. Essentially, the idea was partly a kind of social ideal, part of that moment where the post-war consensus, so-called, gives us the British welfare state, expanded education, better quality public housing, expansion of educational opportunities. So the new towns fit into that idea of really building a new society in the aftermath of the Second World War. But at the same time, there is an economic driver to this as well. And all of this is very particularly clear in Scotland. In Scotland, the new towns were the responsibility of a government department called the Scottish Office. And the Scottish Office was essentially the arm of government which looked after policy and practice in Scotland before Scotland got its own parliament at the end of the 1990s. The role of the Scottish Office was essentially to oversee things like health, education, the economy within Scotland. And the new towns were one way in which it could intervene, if you like, in all of those areas. Particular challenge in Scotland was Glasgow. Glasgow at the end of the Second World War was a city of over 1 million people, a city of great contrasts. Some areas very prosperous, but some areas, particularly inner city areas, incredibly overcrowded. Several hundred people per acre, often living in very, very small flats without their own bathrooms, with very rudimentary kitchen facilities. Really, particularly terrible conditions. And so the idea at the end of the Second World War was that at least 250,000 people needed to be moved out of Glasgow, or needed to leave Glasgow, in order then to make more space for all those who remained. And the new towns were one way of achieving that kind of population dispersal. And that's not to say that the people who moved to the new towns were those who came from the worst of the slums. That actually often wasn't the case. And one of the themes of the book is very much that the new towns appealed to a kind of aspirational set of people, often from slightly sort of skilled working class backgrounds, who wanted to make new lives for their families. But the idea very much to move people out of Glasgow to then allow Glasgow's reconstruction. But also the new towns would help in the kind of economic transformation or modernisation of Scotland. And here the story is that very much that central Scotland, Glasgow, had grown up in the 19th century as a centre of heavy engineering, things like shipbuilding particularly. Those industries were already falling into decline in the 1920s and 1930s. That was accelerated by the Great Depression of the 1930s. And so the Scottish Office wanted to cultivate, attract new sorts of skilled industry, light engineering, technology. In time, this would mean things like sort of computers, even by the time you get to the 1960s, 70s. And the new towns were seen as places where those new kinds of industry might develop, both in a practical sense that there was land available that could be developed, but also it was thought that they were more attractive sites for investment, easier to kind of sell the idea of investing in these places than Glasgow to international businesses. And you see that very clearly in the way that the civil servants describe the new towns in those post-war decades in the archive, that they believed that the new towns were this kind of attractive face of a new Scotland. So it's about social change, it's about economic change as well.
What were the main characters involved? I know obviously of Robert Bruce and his plans for Glasgow. Was it people of his ilk? Were there central figures to this kind of process in the Scottish New Towns movement?
Yes, so within the Scottish Office, there were a number of officials who were absolutely committed to the idea of new towns, and they were in post for quite a long period at the start of the programme in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and that continuity was kind of important in driving things forward. You also had kind of modernist architect planners like Robert Matthew, who produced a big plan for the Clyde Valley region, along with the leading planner Patrick Abercrombie, and their Clyde Valley plan set out where some of the locations of the new towns could be. Mm-hmm. And this, in a way, was being driven from the Scottish Office slightly against the will of people like Bruce in Glasgow, that sort of whose plan for Glasgow said, actually, no, we don't need to move anyone out at all. We can completely rehouse Glasgow within its own boundary. And so in the early days of the New Town programme in Scotland in the late 1940s, early 50s, there was a kind of battle between the Scottish Office on the one hand going, no, we must move people out to these new places, and Glasgow on the other hand going, no, we think we can keep everyone close to hand. And part of that was also that the Scottish Office wasn't always all that impressed with the kind of housing that Glasgow had been building, which, although it was 1,000,000 times better than the housing that it replaced, the Scottish Office just didn't think it was good enough. So again, for the Scottish Office, there was an idea that by building kind of exemplary new towns, they could show authorities like Glasgow a kind of more enlightened way forward.
Was there a political bent to this as well? Was this a programme that was advanced by both sides? You've talked about the kind of more unified form of government at the tail end of the Second World War. But was this more of a conservative thing? And I suppose I ask because I'm interested in London Docklands, and some of the characters in London Docklands cut their teeth in the Scottish New Towns movement. The London Docklands Development Corporation is obviously closely aligned with Thatcherism. And also this emphasis on enterprise and a kind of the strivers, not the skivers, to use whoever it was, horrible language. So was this more a conservative idea?
Well, interesting, one of the key figures in driving forward the kind of initial idea of the new towns in Scotland was Tom Johnston, who was Secretary of State for Scotland during the Second World War in Churchill's coalition government, but was from a very strong Labour Glasgow tradition. And there was a degree of consensus, I think, around the idea of the new towns for much of their history. But that's not to say that certainly Glasgow Corporation, the kind of city council in Glasgow in the post-war years, wouldn't have seen the new towns as being something of a kind of imposition on them. I mean, in this respect, there are differences even within the Labour Party, and Glasgow Corporation's view of what being Labour wasn't necessarily the view of Labour politicians and others in Edinburgh. Certainly for Glasgow, the new towns initially were seen as a bit of a kind of a Trojan horse that was being sort of driven into them to kind of neutralise some of their own power. So, my colleague Miles Glendinning has talked a little bit about this in the book, and certainly, his interpretation is that the new towns sort of come from a slightly perhaps more right of centre perspective. But, it's true that both political parties drove them forward. It's originated, as I say, by Tom Johnston of Labour within the coalition government. In a Scottish context, it's the post-war Labour government which enacts the 1946 New Towns Act that sets up the framework through which you can create new towns across England, Wales and Scotland. And it's very unusual that it's a single piece of legislation for Scotland, England and Wales. Normally Scotland would have its own housing legislation at that time. And although the Conservatives during the 1950s, they were in government from 1951, were less keen on new towns. That is the period when Cumbernauld was designated in Scotland, the only 1950s designation, and that recognises really the gravity of the challenge in dealing with overcrowding in Glasgow, in dealing with reconstruction, in dealing with the economy. And the designation of Livingston at the start of the 60s is under a Conservative authority. Also Irvine, although it's designated under Labour, again, the genesis of that is under a sort of Conservative era as well. So there are politicians on both sides who liked the idea of the new towns and drove them forward, just as though there were politicians on both sides who were less convinced by the idea of the new towns, whether that's because they saw them as expensive or because they saw them as kind of eroding their population base.
Thank you. That's really interesting. I guess I ask because new towns, and my experience of new towns, Cumbernauld, you've mentioned East Kilbride, Livingston, Glenrothes, and Irvine are the ones I've visited. I might have visited others, I can't remember. But they're quite modernist. And I suppose that, again, sort of more closely aligns with a politically left of centre politics, whereas one might expect a new town developed by more conservative people to be, I guess, more traditionally orientated. What were the influences on the design of these new towns? I mean, how did they manifest? Is there a kind of consistent characteristic amongst these Scottish new towns? What kind of influences were at play?
So the new towns, being the products of those post-war decades, initially are very much centres of modernism. But I think it's important to note that the planning of these places changes over time. So East Kilbride and Glenrothes are relatively low density, based around neighbourhoods, whereas Cumbernauld was designated in the mid-50s amid a kind of search for a greater urbanity. So much more compact plan, rejects the idea of neighbourhoods for a focus on the town centre, which was conceived as a megastructure. Livingston has a grid plan and is, again, conceived in the early 60s in an era where mobility, flexibility are starting to be important. So the Livingston grid anticipates Milton Keynes in England, actually, with the idea that the grid would lay down a basic framework without locking in too many assumptions about what might actually come further down the line. Irvine, you have a scatter in the original plan of quite discrete communities linked by quite fast roads. So there's a kind of city region idea. They're, again, looking perhaps to the United States. They're interested in mobility and the fact that more and more people have got cars, and therefore actually you can create a much more dispersed kind of urban environment. And Stonehouse retrenches slightly back to something almost a little more like East Kilbride. So there's a flexibility in planning, which shows us some of the big shifts of the period, but architecturally as well. You get in the earliest developments a quite low-key modernism, slightly Scandinavian, perhaps in inflection, brick, which is unusual as a building material to see facing brick in Scotland at that time. Pitched roofs, really nice landscaping. Cumbernauld, much more compact, but also a growing search for a kind of modernised version of Scottish vernacular. So they're using traditional sort of rendering. They're looking to kind of picturesque villages for some of their inspiration. Livingston briefly explored prefabrication. Irvine gets going really in the 1970s, at the moment when modernism is starting perhaps to be a wee bit more questioned and challenged. And so you get, again, some of the same kind of modernist vernacular influences as Cumbernauld, but also a quite interesting, maybe you'd want to call it postmodern, slightly more historicist set of buildings develop. So I think for us as writing the book, one of our key ideas as authors was to say that what a new town is changes over time in terms of its planning, in terms of its architecture. It's too easy just to think new town and to go concrete, big roads, and then to stop thinking. But actually there is this kind of difference over time, and a difference between each of the places based on what they were trying to do, who was involved, what their ideas were, what the kind of economic context was perhaps as well. So, great variety, I think, actually, in terms of what the new towns were and continue to be like.
So was this a progressive kind of policy? And by that I mean, did subsequent new towns learn from the ones before? Was it a kind of refining technique, or was it each time they kind of somehow acquired a plot of land? And maybe you can explain how that kind of action gets done, because getting any infrastructure done these days seems to be an absolute nightmare, whereas obviously this was done virtually autocratically. But was there a sense that this policy was initiated and then would kind of refine itself over time, or was it, as I say, was it not responsive in that kind of way?
So the new towns are distinctive as a programme in that they were the creations of central government. Central government decides where they're going to go, the Scottish office in the case of the Scottish new towns. And there was then a formal process called designation, which is where the site would be identified, delineated. Generally, there would be a public inquiry, but that's on a much reduced scale to what a public inquiry would be now. They were generally over pretty quickly, maybe a few tweaks to the designated area. And at that stage, the officials would set up what was called a development corporation. And again, the existence of a development corporation is one of the distinctive features of these new towns. The development corporations were kind of all-powerful bodies which existed within the public sector, but they're not elected. They don't have kind of elected representatives. Their job was to plan and build the new town. And they would have a staff of architects, planners and others who would be overseeing what got built, and they would manage what was then built. So a lot of the housing, almost all the housing in the early years, was rented from the development corporation. Over time there's more owner occupation, but even then the development corporation would be overseeing what got built. And there was a career path in many ways. If you were a young architect in the late 1940s, you probably would have wanted to work either at the London County Council, because that was a kind of hotbed of creativity, or in one of the new towns, because these were exciting places where people were going to build these kind of amazing modernist urban environments. And so you might start off in quite a junior role in somewhere like East Kilbride, and then few years later, Cumbernauld gets designated a new town, and so great, okay, opportunity for promotion. I'll move to Cumbernauld, and then you could move to Livingston, Irvine, and that you get this sense within Scotland and indeed beyond Scotland of people moving around the new towns and developing their careers. So ideas were transported between the different places by the designers. The officials themselves, again, not just the architects, would also be moving around, talking to each other, meeting with central government officials. But there's also a sense of reaction between them. So Cumbernauld very deliberately not doing the kind of low density neighbourhoods of East Kilbride, very deliberately going for something more compact, more urban, if you like, kind of harder landscaping, more densely arranged housing, more emphasis on mobility. And some of that reflects kind of architectural fashions, but also just changing circumstances. In the early days of the New Towns programme in the 1940s, the number of cars on the road was relatively limited. By the mid-50s, that had started to increase. By the 60s, it had increased again. So, part of the reaction, if you like, is saying, well, these earlier new towns, perhaps, okay, they've thought about cars, but we need to think about it even more. And there were other changes as well, as people's expectations for their housing increased. New town housing was always relatively well specified, generous spatially, typically quite well built most of the time. But what people might have expected in the late 1940s is different from what they would have expected in the late 1960s. So some of the kind of evolution and reaction is a response to kind of changing expectations, really.
That's fascinating. So I've been writing down questions as you've been talking, and I want to get to the question of what was the experience of these new towns, and that's a kind of methodological question as well. But I thought perhaps before that, I wanted to really understand how they came up with the specification of buildings within these kinds of places. Like, how did they identify what would constitute a new town? You've mentioned industry, you've mentioned resi, but there's more to that.
Yeah, so the whole idea of the new towns was that there would be more than just housing estates.
Yeah.
One of the, particularly in Scotland, the Scottish Office's criticisms of 1920s, 30s Glasgow was that Glasgow had built big housing estates, but they were just housing. And the Scottish Office said these are places which are relatively socially homogenous. That may or may not have been true, but that was their perception, and there are no jobs there. Mm-hmm. So the idea of the new towns was that you would have all of these different elements. And because these are the products of the public sector in the kind of heyday of the public sector, they could do that. These are ways to deliver these kind of policy objectives. In the early days of the new towns, late 1940s, 50s into the 60s, vast majority of the housing was rented from the development corporations, and therefore it had to meet certain kind of standards and expectations which were common to public sector housing generally. But often the development corporations would try and do better, actually go beyond the kind of minimum standard. And you see that both in terms of the housing itself, but also the kind of landscaped settings that the houses were built in. Typically the new towns were very strong with their landscape teams and their landscape departments, and the landscaping itself was quite generous. So it's kind of public sector housing plus. This is supposed to be as good as it gets, really. And that certainly seems to have been one of the attractions for people moving to this sort of housing. And often it was a bit of a sacrifice for people moving to these places. Obviously, personally, you're perhaps moving out of a community in Glasgow or Edinburgh, even where you've been very settled, and you're moving to a new place that's half built and getting a new job, and your children are going to new schools, and that's quite taxing. But also, it was expensive. New town rents were higher than local authority rents in kind of council housing, and particularly in Glasgow, which had a tradition of low rents. So people, often not quite necessarily struggled, but it wasn't necessarily the easiest experience moving to these places. And one of the interesting stories that we see in the book is the way that often two incomes were necessary really to support the family unit. But the new towns also provided opportunities for women to work in ways that were not necessarily the case in somewhere like Glasgow or older centres. There was perhaps part-time work available in light industry and engineering, and particularly quite skilled work, which was available. So yeah, it was often difficult, but people felt that those sacrifices were worth making for the quality of the house with its garden, the privacy that offered compared perhaps with a tenement stair in Glasgow, and for the better way of life that the children of the family might sort of look forward to in the future.
What was the role of architects in defining this programme, and particularly the spatial and aesthetic or material qualities of it? Obviously, you've mentioned East Kilbride, Glenrothes, Cumbernauld, so we have looming over us, I think, necessarily Gillespie, Kidd and Coir, and Izzy Metzline particularly. Were architects given much sway outside of those very authored buildings? I mean, as you say, they were involved in developing plans and designing houses, but these were fairly standard units once designed. So I'm kind of interested in who was making these moves and who was kind of helping define the aesthetic palette of these places.
So the development corporations would have their own architectural staff who would be involved in some of the planning decisions and the design decisions, and a lot of the housing would be the responsibility of those architects. As you say, though, there were also architects brought in from outside. So Gillespie, Kidd and Coir, one of the kind of most prominent practices in post-war Scotland. And those practices sometimes would be involved in housing, but often would be delivering things like churches, for which the sites would be allocated by the development corporations. Sometimes schools, which were the responsibility of the local authority rather than the development corporation. You would also have contractors, and in some cases the new town development corporations would do deals with particular contractors to deliver housing, particularly in the case of tall blocks, but also some of the prefabricated systems as well. So there's a mixture of in-house work, some housing and other projects by external designers, and the influence in some cases of kind of contractor systems-led approaches.
How were communities consulted? And so this kind of a question I'm kind of interested in is the issue around the experience of these places. Obviously, they were preferable in most circumstances, at least materially, to the inner city, the shambolic inner city conditions of, say, for example, Glasgow. How did people experience this? Did they enjoy it? Did it work? And I guess methodologically, in terms of the book, how did you go about documenting and measuring this?
So as I say, people generally chose to move to the new towns, although in some cases...
Yeah, but advertising will make people do crazy things.
Yeah, in some cases they were vetted and interviewed, and there are certainly stories of people being visited in their Glasgow flat to see whether they were, I don't know, you might say, the right sort of people to move to the new town. I mean, perhaps pragmatically, could they afford it at the very least? The sort of thing that now comes across as sort of very paternalistic and rather patronising, and we wouldn't do that sort of thing now. Once they got there, they would be allocated a house. Generally, actually, in the early years, you had to have a job already to get allocated the house. You couldn't actually just kind of turn up in East Kilbride and say, I want to live here. So they would be allocated somewhere to live. That might not have been exactly the house they wanted. There's a story in the book that we have of someone who Valerie interviewed for the book, where he drove around, he picked a house that he fancied, and he said he couldn't have that house because that was for managers, and he wasn't a manager. He had to have a different house. And the story that then emerges is very much of, particularly in the early years, communities building a sense of community themselves, almost out of necessity, as everyone kind of got to grips with these places as they were being built around them, as the infrastructure was being completed, as they settled in as families. And sometimes the development corporations would kind of have a feedback mechanism. They would go out and talk to people living in the early areas to find out what was working, what wasn't working. But this isn't, certainly until the 1970s, really the kind of age of community consultation that you would expect now. Even where, in the case of Stonehouse, there is sort of video footage of the proposals for Stonehouse Newtown being presented to the people who lived in that area before any work was done. It's very much, this is a map of what we're going to do. Have you got any questions about it? But we're probably not really going to change what we're going to do. So it's not to say that, once places were underway, that changes were made in response to what worked, what didn't work, what people thought. But it's not the kind of consultation you would find now. But over the longer term, so one of the things that was key in the book was to understand how these places were experienced. And Valerie Wright and Lynn Abrams have a lot of experience in oral history, particularly. And their approach was to try to interview people from a range of different generations, sometimes even within a single family, to understand what the experience of the new town had been like over time. And these were quite lengthy interviews, which were recorded and transcribed, which touched on themes like community, work, family, the home, and leisure, all these sorts of things, and tried to get people to elaborate on that in a fairly open-ended fashion.
It's a lovely idea indeed. New towns are also somewhat seen as being archaic and in need of rejuvenation. That is to say, are in a state of decline. And obviously recently there's been the stories in the press around the demolition work proposed in Cumbernauld to the brutalist megastructure in the town centre. If there was a decline, and maybe you can clarify what that means, what were the causes of this? And you mentioned earlier the return to the city in the 70s and 80s. My guess is that if you move out a significant number of middle-class people who pay lots of tax from the urban centre, you sort of reduce the economic viability of cities, and then you get this kind of peculiar tension emerging, and the city has to try and fight back, I suppose. I mean, is that a reasonable thing?
So by the late 1970s, there was a kind of growing idea that you couldn't keep on decentralising places like Glasgow indefinitely. The population could not just keep on reducing, and that was
what did the population get down to?
That's a good question. Is it down to 500,000?
Half a million, okay.
So it certainly has gone down a lot. Not all to the new towns. I mean, the areas around Glasgow have expanded in other ways, and people have moved to those. So while the greater Glasgow area is, I think, around 1 million, not all of that is within the city boundary, I guess you would say. But yes, by the end of the 70s, there was a sense that you couldn't keep on decentralising indefinitely. And there were changes in local government in Scotland, which saw the creation of new regional authorities beyond the level of the kind of old Glasgow City Corporation. You have a big new regional authority called Strathclyde, which was kind of strong enough to stand up to the Scottish office and say, enough, we don't want any more of this. We want to actually invest in Glasgow and in the existing centres. And also, I mean, the population targets in the 1960s, the population projections had been rather ambitious, isn't the right word. They were much higher than was proved to then actually be the case. At the start of the 70s, it was clear that the population was not increasing in the way that had been imagined that it would do. And so again, the need for the new towns starts to be challenged. So the Scottish office kind of maintained the idea that actually, no, these were important places for economic investment. But essentially the programme was scaled back. That's not to say it ends. And again, I think one of the key messages of the book is the new towns continue in Scotland under the development corporations into the 1990s. And that is distinctive within a kind of UK context. A lot of the English new towns start to be wound up in the 1980s. And so Scotland, there's a slightly different story that reflects the importance that was still given to them. But yes, the days of expansion were over. And then in the 1990s, the development corporations were wound down, and the responsibility for the new towns was passed to other bodies, such as the local authorities. And that's a challenge for the new towns. These were conceived as places that would have these kind of all-encompassing, all-powerful development corporations looking after them, advocating for them. And now they're part of a sort of different administrative setup. They've lost that kind of special status, if you like, and also at a time when a lot of housing has been sold off. People have chosen to buy their own public sector, what had been built as public sector homes. People have chosen to buy those. Some of those have ended up in the private rented sector. So there's a kind of fragmentation of tenure across what were once upon a time much more homogeneous in being rented. And of course, the early buildings are of an age where they, in many cases, now need investment. They're 40, 50, 60, 70 years old. So there are absolutely challenges for the new towns, which are kind of amplified by the fact that it's all happening at once. Somewhere like East Kilbride, an enormous amount was built in the 50s, and it's all the same age. But that said, the housing areas in many of the new towns, in many cases, are often still very well looked after, very popular. These are good quality houses, and the landscaping is still very attractive and mature. The challenge, as you allude to, are things like the town centres, and in particular Cumbernauld town centre, which was built as this kind of bold megastructure, a kind of infinitely flexible, infinitely expandable, multifunctional structure that would be everything that a town centre needed to be, a kind of new age town centre for the 1960s. And clearly there were assumptions made in planning that which have been difficult in reality, and have not worn well, we could say. But there are challenges faced by the retail sector generally in a kind of post-COVID era, in an era of online shopping. And so all the new towns are kind of having to grapple with those sorts of challenges, if you like, particularly in the case of the central areas.
Almost as if they were urban but not urban enough. And in this age of urbanization, which is a phenomenon that I think we tend to think of as something you see in the global south, and we can track it in the global south. It's nice and exciting, and you make telly shows about it. But I'm always struck when you ask students, which then came from the countryside to the city, British students and or international students who have ended up in the city, and it's still this phenomenon that is internal. And I suppose the experience of the new town had a very post-war vibe to it, very mid-century vibe to it, which is suburbanite, polite, clean, clear, easy to get around, but it's not quite Glasgow city centre or Leith, is it? So I guess that they're going to struggle in the face of that kind of experiential urbanism, which has become the kind of way that cities now perform.
Well, I think even in the sort of 1960s, we found through the oral history, people say, they would go to Glasgow for a night out, or perhaps because they, of course, still had family living in Glasgow. So I think there was always that sort of pull back to Glasgow in particular. But at the same time, I mean, the assumption would be for many years that you would shop in the new town, and the shopping landscape has changed. Glasgow, the regeneration of central Glasgow has changed that, the shopping provision there, and it's very attractive. There are also big out-of-town shopping centres in the greater Glasgow area, which effectively are competing with the new towns. And it's a sort of interesting reversal, because you could go back to the 1970s, and East Kilbride Development Corporation is sort of trumpeting the fact that people are driving from across South Glasgow and the kind of surrounding countryside to come to East Kilbride, and that international businesses, international retail chains are building in East Kilbride rather than Glasgow. And now, East Kilbride town centre, like Cumbernauld, there are proposals to reduce the scale of the shopping elements, to bring residential uses into that. Because East Kilbride is now competing with these other centres and with a kind of rejuvenated Glasgow as well.
The story you tell about new towns is one of essentially hope and joy and courage, and I like it. And it's a very interesting one. I mean, were they successful for a start?
Well, you say it's all about joy. I think one of the things we wanted to talk about a bit in the book was that while we contest the idea of the Newtown blues, which was something that was often discussed in the contemporary literature in the 1950s, 60s, we don't entirely hold with the Newtown blues, but we don't want it to be a story of completely unalloyed optimism. And I think the oral history and the social history side of the book particularly covers topics like family breakdown, unemployment, some quite challenging things, actually, which are not necessarily unique to the new towns, but certainly in some cases moving to the new towns exacerbated people's pressures, the financial pressures I've already talked about a little bit as well. But I think there was an element of hope about these places, that they were going to be the centres of economic growth, that they were going to be places where the younger generation would have new opportunities, where families could be kind of reformed in a new way, where people would have better housing, would have the opportunity for perhaps greater privacy. So there was a lot that was seen in positive terms about them, and a lot riding on them, if you like. Were they successful? Define success. It's a really tricky question. I mean, many people moved to the new towns. East Kilbride consistently exceeded its population targets. Its kind of target figures were increased several times. It had the advantage there that obviously it was the first. Irvine never really got that same chance to take off. But all of these new towns are places that people want to move to. There's new housing still being built around all of them. And there's still places they're attracting business and investment. So, in those respects, I think you could say that they have been successful. So yeah, I take generally a positive view of them, I think.
Yeah, I think anybody who had to grow up in the dilapidation of inner city Britain and were offered this possibility would probably certainly see it as such. And likewise, the other peripheralisation projects that they did in Glasgow around Easterhouse and Drumchapel and places like that as well. What can we learn in terms of our contemporary development needs, house building needs, settlement building needs? Do they tell us anything? Are they a good model on which to base our future plans?
I think there are elements of them that we probably wouldn't now want to replicate. The focus on the car is perhaps something we would question now. Although East Kilbride, they did build cycle paths in the 1940s, but we would wonder whether that was the need to have a car to get around some of these places. We would now question, but at the same time, I think there are things that can be learnt from them. And I think foremost amongst that is the way in which the new towns show us how kind of social policy, economic policy can interrelate with each other and with the built environment. There is a kind of holistic view here. And they're also, I think the other thing that's important is the idea of long-term thinking. So the advantage of the public sector leading these places, the development corporations, was that these were not solely commercial projects that were designed to kind of generate a quick return and then the builders would move on. These were conceived over a longer period of time and in ways that were perhaps more generous than the private sector, left to its own devices, would have been willing to countenance. So, I mean, again, there's an idealist in me in all of that, because the days of that sort of scale of public sector project do seem now to be long since over. But I think, we could learn things from that about the value of long-term planning, regardless of who is actually then going to try and deliver that. And the value of a kind of generous approach to design. It doesn't necessarily mean radical. And again, one of the things in the book that we stress is that what we call the mainstream modernism of the new towns is significant, and that historians need to think about the mainstream as much as we might get excited about the radical, bold moves like Cumbernauld Town Centre or the Irvine megastructure. So good design is key. Design codes perhaps might be the contemporary equivalent of some of that. So I think there are things that we can learn in terms of long-term planning, in terms of process and generosity, as much as we might perhaps find different ways now of delivering some of those things.
What a great point to finish on. Alistair, you're an amazingly encyclopedic mind. It's a pleasure to listen to you.
Thank you very much. Well, I hope people will enjoy the book. It is available, thanks to the generosity of the Leverhulme Trust, as an open access ebook. So if you go to Bloomsbury Collections, you can download it for free, although the conventional print copy is also available for those who want to put it on their shelves. But thank you very much for having me on, Ambrose. Again, I should acknowledge the contributions of all my co-authors, Lynn Abrams, Kat Breen, Miles Glendinning, Diane Waters and Valerie Wright, and the Leverhulme Trust in supporting the project. It's been great fun.
New life, new love. Where's the heart I was dreaming of? I need a new hope, new dream, another part in a different scene. That's the ticket, Pet Shop Boys. You get it. Thank you to Alistair for speaking with me. It was great fun. Of course, thanks to his co-authors too, even in their absence. And thanks to Bloomsbury for the PDF of the book. Please see the podcast description for links to Alistair's professional and Instagram profile, and to the book too. And thanks for listening.